Here is the thing, nobody in a suit on television is willing to say out loud. The side with the bigger army is not winning this war. And the side that everyone spent 2 years calling out gunned, outmanned, and on the verge of collapse has quietly, methodically turned the entire logic of this conflict upside down. That is not a take. That is what the maps show. That is what the casualty figures confirm. That is what the movement of elite units across a 1,000-kilometer front tells anyone who bothers to read it honestly. And yet the narrative you are being fed in headlines, in think tank summaries, in the breathless diplomatic coverage, still treats this as a war of attrition that the larger power is slowly grinding its way through. It is not. What is actually unfolding in eastern Ukraine right now is one of the most significant military reversals of the 21st century, happening in plain sight and being systematically misread by almost every mainstream outlet covering it. You deserve to understand why. So let's go through it, all of it, without the comfortable omissions. Start with the demand, because the demand tells you everything. Before any ceasefire conversation can even begin, one side has placed a precondition on the table: full territorial withdrawal, complete, non-negotiable. The phrase used in official communications leaves no interpretive wiggle room. And this demand is coming from the side that entered this year with nearly 600,000 personnel deployed along the contact line, 600,000 soldiers. To an outside observer, that number sounds like overwhelming force. It sounds like the kind of mass that simply cannot be stopped. That is what it was designed to sound like. That is the psychological function of announcing that number publicly. But here is what that number actually represents when you look at what it has produced in the field over the last 6 months. Russia's spring offensive, the push that was supposed to shatter Ukrainian defensive lines and deliver the Donbass, captured approximately 350 square kilometers of territory. For context, that is roughly the footprint of a mid-sized city. And the price paid for that footprint was measured in tens of thousands of soldiers dead, an advance rate that has now declined by roughly 80% compared to the previous year, and the near total consumption of strategic reserves that were supposed to fuel the next phase of the campaign. That is not a military machine pressing forward. That is a military machine consuming itself. Within the Donetsk theater alone, the push to take 53 kilometers of ground cost more than 25,000 soldiers. 25,000, and those soldiers did not die taking an undefended plane. They died running into something that the Russian General Staff apparently did not fully model or chose to ignore before committing those forces to the assault. What they ran into is the structure that analysts have begun calling the Fortress Belt. It runs from the Kostiantynivka axis through to Druskivka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk. And it is not a line in the traditional sense. It is a layered defensive architecture, overlapping fields of fire, integrated drone coverage, deep mining, hardened positions that Ukraine spent months reinforcing precisely because they knew this assault was coming. The Russian command looked at this structure and told their government it would fall quickly. It did not fall. It did not even crack at the strategic level. What it did instead was function exactly as the architects intended. Every Russian unit that probed the southern edges of this belt encountered destruction waiting for it. Every armored formation that tried to push through ran into drone swarms that turned it into burning wreckage before it could close with the defensive line. Every axis that looked promising on a Russian planning map led directly into a system specifically designed to make that axis a dead end. And here is the part that should genuinely alarm Moscow's planners if they are being honest with themselves internally. The losses absorbed against this belt are not only killing soldiers, they are consuming the reserves that were supposed to be held back for the next phase. The forces that were supposed to represent the punch behind the punch are being thrown piecemeal into a structure they cannot break, and they are not coming back in any operational sense. Russia is paying an enormous price to stand still. And standing still when you are the side that needs to advance to achieve your political objectives is indistinguishable from losing. But the territorial stall is only one dimension of what is happening. Beneath it, there is a structural problem that is far more dangerous for Russia's long-term capacity to wage this war. And it is visible in something that military analysts have tracked throughout the first months of 2026, a pattern that has been called in various forms a rotational death spiral. Here is how it works. When one sector of the front begins to deteriorate under pressure, the Russian General Staff does not have fresh, trained reserves to send in. Instead, they pull capable units from adjacent sectors, sectors that are themselves under pressure, and rush them laterally across the front to plug the gap. Every time they do this, the sector they just pulled troops from becomes thinner, which creates a new vulnerability, which eventually requires another emergency redeployment, which creates another gap, and so on. There is no bottom to this cycle because it is not being driven by tactical wisdom. It is being driven by the absence of the reserves that would make tactical wisdom possible. The clearest example of this played out in early May. One of Russia's most capable armored formations, a division-level unit from the Central Military District, not a reserve force, not a second echelon unit, but one of the most combat-capable armored formations in the Russian order of battle, was pulled from its designated sector and rushed down exposed roads toward a collapsing area of the front. Those roads were within range of Ukrainian drone systems. The movement was visible, and the strategic consequence was immediate. The sector they left became a gap. The same pattern repeated with formations from the Eastern Military District. Infantry units were pulled from prepared positions and thrown into chaotic situations they had not been staged for, without the logistical support that prepared offensive operations require. And most tellingly, the units being churned through this rotation include airborne forces and Marine brigades, the elite formations that exist precisely because they are supposed to be preserved for decisive operations. They are being used instead as emergency patching material for a front that has more gaps than the available forces can cover. What this means operationally is that Russia has already exceeded its ability to control the entire front simultaneously. That is not a minor tactical observation. That is the definition of a military that is overstretched relative to its actual capacity, regardless of what the nominal numbers on paper suggest. And while this was happening on the Russian side, Ukraine was doing something completely different. Ukraine was not trying to match Russia's mass with mass. It was doing what asymmetric warfare doctrine says you should do. When you cannot match your opponent's quantity, you attack their system, not their positions. Deep strike operations against logistical nodes 20 to 23 kilometers behind the front line. Targeted destruction of ammunition storage, fuel infrastructure, and command coordination points. Systematic pressure on the supply corridors that keep frontline Russian units functioning. The logic is straightforward. A unit that cannot receive ammunition, reinforcement, or coordinated fire support is not a unit anymore. It is a collection of people waiting to be dislodged from ground they can no longer defend. Two simultaneous drives, one toward Ulivka, one toward Orikhiv, were executed during this period. The timing was not coincidental. The Russian command found itself managing two emergencies at the same moment, forced to split its already depleted decision-making capacity across two crises, neither of which could wait. And during that window of maximum confusion, Ukrainian forces liberated approximately 244 square kilometers of territory, pushed Russian positions back in multiple directions, brought critical logistics routes within strike range, and cleared between 9 and 12 settlements from occupation. This is Russia's first clear, measurable net territorial loss since the Kursk operation in the summer of 2024, and the mechanism that produced it was not a massive armored assault. It was the careful, deliberate destruction of Russia's ability to function in that sector, followed by exploitation of the resulting collapse. That is new generation warfare. And Ukraine has become its most capable practitioner. The drone campaign alone deserves a full separate analysis. What Ukraine has built is a strike architecture that has effectively eliminated the concept of a safe rear area for Russian logistics within a radius of up to 200 kilometers. Supply depots that used to sit comfortably behind the line are now targets. Fuel storage is now a liability. Train junctions and bridge infrastructure in occupied territories are no longer reliable. The practical consequence is that Russian supply convoys are taking significantly longer to reach frontline positions, which means frontline units are receiving less of what they need, less frequently, with less predictability. An army operating under those logistical conditions simply cannot sustain offensive momentum. That is not an ideological claim. That is the material reality of how armies function. Now step back from the battlefield for a moment, because beneath the tactical picture, Russia is experiencing something that matters far more for the long arc of this conflict. The structural capacity to replace what is being lost is degrading at the same time the losses are accelerating. Recruitment rates fell roughly 20% in the first quarter of 2026 compared to the same period the previous year. At a moment when monthly combat losses are estimated by multiple tracking organizations at above 35,000, that gap is not administrative, it is existential in military planning terms. You cannot sustain a high-intensity land war if the rate at which you are losing soldiers is accelerating while the rate at which you are replacing them is declining. The math does not work regardless of how many times you announce that it does. The response to this recruitment crisis reveals more than any official statement could. Conscription pressure being applied through universities, contract obligations being structured in ways that leave recruits with few legal exit options, financial incentives that sound significant until you consider what they represent to a family that receives them as survivor benefits. And despite all of this, the population most needed for modern warfare, young, technically educated, capable of operating complex systems, is finding ways to not be where the military needs them to be. Many are leaving the country. Others are navigating registration systems in ways that keep them out of reach. The information that the front is extraordinarily lethal has penetrated Russian society more deeply than the state's media apparatus can contain. And this matters beyond simple headcount. Russia is not just losing bodies, it is losing the technically capable people who can operate drone systems, maintain electronic warfare equipment, keep communication networks functional. The replacements being assembled are less trained and less experienced than the forces they are replacing. Russian military performance quality is declining even as the pace of Russian military activity continues. That combination, more activity, lower quality, produces a very specific kind of institutional degradation that is extremely difficult to reverse mid-conflict. On the industrial side, the picture is equally stark. Armored vehicle losses across the full period of this war have reached figures in the tens of thousands. Russian production capacity cannot replace those losses with systems that meet the requirements of modern warfare, because the microelectronics and precision optics that such systems require were largely sourced from suppliers now blocked by sanctions. The practical response to this gap has been to pull Soviet-era equipment out of long-term storage and ship it forward. These are platforms designed in the 1960s, maintained in varying states of preservation, and sent to a front defined by precision-guided munitions and autonomous aerial systems. They are not competitive, they are targets, and the decision to send them anyway is an admission that there is nothing better available. Meanwhile, Ukraine, with continued access to advanced components through its partner network, continues to field increasingly sophisticated strike and surveillance systems in growing quantities. The technological gap between the two sides is not narrowing, it is widening in the domain that matters most for how this war is actually being fought. So what does a government do when its conventional military strategy is failing, when recruitment is declining, when industrial capacity is degrading, and when the front is producing losses rather than advances? It reaches for the instrument that does not require soldiers or factories. It reaches for the nuclear threat. The escalation nuclear rhetoric from Moscow in recent months follows a pattern that is recognizable to anyone who studies how declining powers manage perception when their actual leverage is shrinking. Announcements about strategic missile systems, references to hypersonic delivery vehicles, state media content that makes explicit the consequences of nuclear exchange for European population centers. All of this is calibrated to achieve a specific psychological effect on Western governments, to make the political cost of continuing to support Ukraine feel like it might eventually include civilizational risk. But look at what this rhetoric actually reveals. A military that was genuinely succeeding on the ground would not need to invoke planetary destruction to deter its opponents. Conventional success is its own deterrent. You do not threaten the apocalypse when you are winning the war. You threaten it when you have run out of other cards. The nuclear posture is not evidence of strength. It is a confession of conventional failure dressed in language designed to be too frightening to analyze clearly. The suggestion of a potential opening of a northern front through Belarus follows the same logic. The threat is designed to force Ukraine to keep forces tied down in the north rather than committing them to more consequential sectors. But the actual probability of Belarus entering this war in a way that changes its trajectory is low, for structural reasons that have nothing to do with military capacity. Lukashenko's regime depends on Russian support to survive. That support is contingent on Belarus remaining a useful tool. A domestically unpopular military adventure that destabilizes the regime would destroy its utility for Moscow, and the Belarusian military, whatever its nominal capabilities, does not have the logistical architecture or the training cycle to execute a major offensive operation of the kind that would actually threaten Kiev. Ukraine maintains alert forces in the north. It has restructured its northern defensive posture toward flexibility rather than mass. The threat is being managed at an acceptable cost. What we are watching across all of these dimensions simultaneously is a strategic system running out of viable options in real time. The tactical gains have stalled below any meaningful threshold. The strategic reserves are being burned in the process of attempting those gains. The logistics are being degraded by aerial strike campaigns. The recruitment base is contracting. The industrial base is producing equipment that is not competitive with the systems it faces. And the escalatory instruments being reached for nuclear rhetoric, alliance theater, maximalist opening demands, and diplomatic channels are the instruments of a negotiating position that has no conventional military reality behind it. The gap between what the Kremlin's strategy requires and what Russian military power can actually deliver has never been wider. And a 600,000 person deployment that cannot breach an integrated defensive line that is being forced into rotational chaos by Ukrainian pressure, and that is consuming its best formations as emergency patching material, is not a force on the verge of a decisive breakthrough. It is a force that has already passed the operational high-water mark of this campaign without achieving its objectives. The demand for complete territorial withdrawal before any ceasefire discussion can begin is not the demand of a party that controls the battlefield. It is the demand of a party that is trying to use diplomatic language to claim something the ground is not delivering. And the party being asked to make that concession, having just liberated 244 square kilometers, having pushed Russian logistics routes out of operational range, having demonstrated an asymmetric warfare capability that the world will be studying in military academies for the next generation, has very little incentive to treat that demand as anything other than what it is. None of this resolves the most difficult question. The most difficult question is what comes after the strategic failure becomes undeniable inside the Kremlin itself. A state with nuclear weapons and a government that has built its legitimacy around the premise that this war would succeed does not have a clean path to absorbing failure. The internal political consequences of visible acknowledged defeat are unpredictable in ways that the external military trajectory is not. That is the genuine uncertainty that serious analysts are carrying right now. Not whether Russia's conventional strategy has failed, it has, but what a nuclear-armed state does when it can no longer pretend otherwise. That question does not have a comfortable answer. No serious person should pretend it does. But the starting point for thinking about it clearly is an honest account of where the war actually stands, not where the propaganda of either side claims it stands, not where the diplomatic statements imply it stands, but where the maps, the unit movements, the casualty patterns, and the logistical data all point together. And where they point is this. A military entered this year expecting to be the overwhelming force that would dictate terms. It has instead found itself absorbing losses faster than it can replace them, executing frantic lateral reshuffling of irreplaceable elite units, failing to breach a defensive architecture. It promised its government would fall, and reaching for escalatory rhetoric precisely because conventional momentum has not materialized. The trajectory of this war is not hidden. It is written in the movement of armored divisions being pulled from one crisis to patch another. It is written in the T-62s being shipped from storage because nothing better is available. It is written in the 80% collapse in the rate of advance. It is written in 25,000 soldiers lost for 53 kilometers of ground that has not changed the strategic picture. The war in 2026 is not the war that either side's official statements describe. It is bloodier, slower, more structurally consequential, and more clearly trending in one direction than the comfortable middle ground coverage suggests. And the people who have a stake in what the next 30 years of global security architecture looks like, which is everyone, deserve to understand that clearly, without the omissions that make the story more manageable but less true. What comes next on those front lines will not be decided by rhetoric or diplomatic positioning. It will be decided by the same forces that have shaped every phase of this war: logistics, technical capacity, the ability to absorb losses and reconstitute, and the willingness of external actors to sustain the side that is fighting with greater effectiveness per unit of resource expended. Those are the variables worth watching. Everything else is noise.